For months, a brown bear stood at the edge of a muddy clearing, staring at the earth as if waiting for something. Villagers passed by, watching with uneasy curiosity. But when the bear finally broke the ground and turned over the dirt, what they discovered left the entire town in stunned silence, and forever changed how they saw this wild creature. In a quiet corner of northern Montana, at the edge of a small village pressed between dense pine forests and rocky hills, people began noticing something strange. Every day near dawn, a large brown bear emerged from the woods. His thick coat was streaked with gray, his shoulders broad, his claws long and dark. But it wasn't his size or strength that caught people's attention, it was where he went. Without fail, the bear padded slowly to the edge of a muddy clearing, a patch of earth scarred from logging years ago, where grass struggled to grow. There, he stood for hours, unmoving, his amber eyes fixed on the ground. At first, the villagers were wary. Some locked their doors, others called the wildlife officers. But when rangers came to investigate, they found no signs of aggression. The bear kept his distance from homes, never touched livestock, and avoided human paths. He only watched the clearing. Days passed, then weeks. Curiosity replaced fear. The villagers nicknamed him Old Ben, after the last great bear seen in the area decades ago. Children peered at him through binoculars, hikers whispered about his silent vigil, and hunters stayed away, sensing something sacred in his presence. Among the onlookers was Emma Ree, a retired schoolteacher in her 60s who had lived in the village all her life. From her kitchen window, she watched Old Ben every morning as she drank her coffee. Something about his stillness, his patient gaze, stirred an ache in her chest. One afternoon, Emma couldn't resist. She packed a small bag, binoculars, notebook, water, and made her way through the trees to a low hill overlooking the clearing. She watched as the bear arrived, his heavy body sinking to the ground, chin resting on massive paws. Hours passed. The sun dipped low, casting long shadows across the field. Emma's brow furrowed. What was he waiting for? That night, she dug out old maps, newspaper clippings, and journals. She learned that 20 years ago, before the trees were felled, this clearing had been thick with pine, and home to one of the region's largest bear families. A den had once lain buried beneath the very earth Old Ben watched so faithfully. Emma's heart twisted. What had he lost there? The next morning, Emma was back on the hill, bundled in her old wool coat, notebook balanced on her knees, binoculars pressed to her eyes. Below, Old Ben arrived like clockwork. His massive frame moved with a heaviness that was hard to explain, not just the weight of age or size, but something deeper, as if each step carried a memory. He settled at the edge of the muddy clearing, his breath curling in the cold morning air, his eyes fixed on the same patch of ground. Emma watched for hours. Sometimes, Ben would lift his nose, sniffing the wind as if expecting a familiar scent. Other times, he dug absent-mindedly at the ground, pushing aside stones or tufts of dead grass, only to stop, lower his head, and return to stillness. Word spread through the village. Fathers brought their children, standing quietly at the tree-lean, pointing in hushed voices. Hikers detoured for a glimpse. Even the wildlife officers, at first concerned, now observed from a respectful distance, realizing this bear posed no threat. But no one understood why he came. One evening, Emma knocked on the door of Samuel Grant, a logger who had worked the area when the clearing was first cut 2 decades ago. His weathered face hardened when she mentioned the bear. There was a den there, he admitted quietly. A big one. We didn't know at first. We collapsed part of it by accident. Emma felt her stomach twist. What happened to the bears? Samuel's eyes dropped to his hands. We thought they all scattered. But maybe, his voice trailed off. Emma left that night with a heavy heart. She returned to her maps, tracing the shape of the old forest, wondering if old Ben had once been a cub here, or if he had lost someone in that collapse. The next morning, something changed. Emma arrived on the hill just as the sun broke over the trees. Old Ben was already there, but today, he was restless. His massive paws scraped at the ground, mud flying as he tore through the earth with sudden urgency. Clumps of dirt scattered, and a hush fell over the watching crowd as people gathered along the trees. Ben's breathing was ragged, his shoulders shaking as he dug deeper. Emma's throat tightened as realization washed over her. He wasn't just watching the past, he was trying to bring it back. Emma's heart raced as she watched from the hillside. Below, old Ben's great claws ripped into the earth, mud and roots flying behind him. His breaths came in heavy, uneven huffs, his flanks quivering with effort. He wasn't the patient sentinel anymore. He was a grieving soul, clawing at the past. Villagers lined the trees, their chatter fading into uneasy silence. Parents held their children close. Even the wildlife rangers, usually ready to intervene, hung back, their radios silent. Emma pressed her binoculars to her eyes, her chest tight. She could see the tremble in Ben's shoulders, the wild glint in his amber eyes, the way his claws sank deep into the cold ground. And then, a shift. The ground gave way with a heavy crack as a patch of soil collapsed inward, revealing something buried below. Emma's breath caught. At first, it looked like just rocks and roots. But as Ben nudged aside clumps of earth with his snout, shapes emerged, bone, old, weathered, half-crumbled by time. The curved remains of a skull, unmistakably bare. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Emma clapped a hand to her mouth. The logging collapse. The den. The family. Old Ben had known all along. And for all these years, he had carried that memory. Ben lowered himself to the ground, his massive body folding slowly, almost reverently. His broad head came to rest beside the exposed bones, and he let out a low, rumbling sound, not a growl, but something softer, aching, almost mournful. Tears blurred Emma's vision. Suddenly, the forest no longer felt like a wild place. It felt like a church. The villagers remained still, not daring to disturb the moment. Some quietly wiped their eyes. A child reached up, clutching his father's hand. The air was thick with a quiet grief that bound human and animal alike. Emma scribbled in her notebook, though her fingers trembled. This was no ordinary animal. This was a soul returning home. That night, the village was quiet. No one spoke much at the general store or at the gas station. Conversations that usually revolved around weather, work, or family now drifted into soft murmurs about old Ben. Emma sat at her kitchen table, the small lamp casting a golden glow over her notes. She had tried to write down what she saw, the digging, the bones, the sound Ben made, but no words seemed enough. She kept staring at her notebook, running her fingers along the paper, her chest heavy. Across the village, people shared the same weight. Samuel Grant, the logger who once helped clear that land, stood at his window, his rough hands pressed against the glass. He remembered the noise of falling trees, the laughter of the crew, the careless way they moved through the forest, never imagining what they had buried beneath. Guilt rose like a tide in his chest. By morning, the village decided without speaking, no one approached the clearing. No one called the rangers to remove the bones or drive Ben away. They would let him mourn. Emma walked back to her hill, a thermos of coffee in her hand, her steps slow, reverent. When she arrived, she saw him. Ben lay stretched across the muddy ground, his giant head resting near the fragile remains. His body was still, his breath slow and deep. Around him, crows perched on branches, quiet and watchful. The forest itself seemed to hold its breath. Emma sat on the hillside, tears pricking at her eyes. She thought of her husband, gone 5 years now. She thought of the mornings she still woke expecting to hear his voice, of the empty chair at the table, of the way grief lived inside her like a second shadow. She realized then why Ben's vigil had struck so deep. Grief was not human. It was not something confined to words or rituals or headstones. It was a language written in bones and earth, in the patient waiting at the edge of a muddy field. By midday, children arrived, led by parents who understood that some lessons could not be taught in school. They stood at the trees, watching quietly, learning what it meant to witness another's sorrow without trying to fix or explain it. Emma wondered if Ben would return tomorrow. She wondered if he would leave when his goodbye was complete, or if, like all of them, he would carry his grief until his last breath. Morning came gray and still. Emma stood at her window, the usual mug of coffee warming her hands. Outside, the trees were heavy with mist, their bare branches etched against the pale sky. She hesitated before heading to the hill. Her knees ached, and part of her feared what she might find. But she went anyway. When she reached the clearing, she stopped in her tracks. Old Ben was not alone. 3 other bears, smaller, younger, stood at the edge of the clearing. Their coats were rich brown, their eyes sharp, their bodies tense with caution. For a long moment, they hovered near the trees, watching. Ben didn't move. His massive frame remained curled around the spot where the bones were half exposed in the earth. He lifted his head once, barely, and let out a low, rumbling sound. Not a warning, but something gentler, almost a call. And slowly, one by one, the younger bears stepped forward. Emma's heart thudded as she crouched behind the rocks, binoculars trembling in her hands. She watched as the 3 bears approached, their movements hesitant at first, their noses lifting to scent the air. They circled the clearing, came closer to Ben, then sat, a quiet, solemn ring around the old giant. It was as if they too understood. As if the forest itself had sent witnesses. Word spread quickly through the village. Small groups came to the treeline, standing in hushed awe, parents lifting their children to their shoulders so they could see the rare gathering. The wildlife rangers came too, cameras ready, but no one dared step forward. Emma sat for hours, scribbling notes she barely understood, her eyes filled again and again, not from sadness alone, but from the profound beauty of it. The way the wild mourned its own. The way even animals seemed to hold a kind of ceremony for the past. As the sun dipped low, casting amber light over the clearing, something shifted. Ben rose slowly to his feet. He turned once, gazing back at the patch of disturbed earth, then lifted his great head toward the trees. For a breathless moment, Emma thought he would stay, that he would return to his vigil the next day. But he didn't. With slow, heavy steps, old Ben moved toward the forest. The 3 younger bears followed, their movements fluid and sure, slipping into the trees like shadows. And just like that, the clearing was empty. The villagers stood in stunned silence, the air heavy with something unspoken. Emma pressed a hand to her chest, feeling the ache of it. Old Ben had said his goodbye, and now it was time for all of them to do the same. That night, the village felt different. People gathered in living rooms and kitchens, the soft glow of lamps flickering through the windows. Conversations were quiet, reflective, not about crops or weather or chores, but about old Ben. Children leaned against their parents, listening to stories from elders about a time when bears were feared, hunted, misunderstood. Emma sat by her fireplace, notebook in her lap, fingers tracing the pages filled with her shaky handwriting. She couldn't stop thinking about the last look Ben gave the clearing. It had been deliberate, almost human, a gaze filled with memory and farewell. At dawn, Emma walked to the hill one last time. The clearing lay empty, the muddy earth now marked not by the weight of a giant bear but by quiet stillness. Birds pecked at the edges. Frost glittered across the grass. For the first time in weeks, there was no hulking shape in the early morning light. But as Emma approached, she noticed something she hadn't seen before. Near the center of the clearing, where Ben had dug and laid his head, a single deep track remained, pressed in the mud, the perfect impression of a massive paw. Emma crouched beside it, her fingers trembling as they hovered above the mark. She didn't dare touch it. Behind her, the villagers gathered at the trees. Samuel Grant stepped forward, hat in hand, his weathered face solemn. For years he had carried the weight of what happened on that land, the collapse of the den, the loss they had never acknowledged. Now, facing the silent clearing, his eyes shone with quiet grief. "We should leave it alone," Samuel said softly, his voice cracking. No one argued. Emma stood, wiping her eyes. She turned to face the crowd, her voice steady despite the tightness in her chest. "This clearing belongs to them now." Slowly, the villagers retreated, leaving the land to heal. In the weeks that followed, people came less often. The trees grew taller at the edges. Grasses spread across the scarred earth. And the sounds of the forest returned. But the story of old Ben remained. Emma wrote it all down, every morning vigil, every movement, every tremor in the earth, capturing the moment when a bear's grief softened the heart of an entire village. She sent her words to the local paper, and soon the story spread beyond their borders. People came to see the clearing, not to disturb, but to remember. And at night, when the forest fell quiet, Emma sometimes imagined she heard the low rumbling voice of old Ben in the wind, not as a ghost or legend but as the lasting memory of a creature who taught them all how to mourn and how to let go. Spring arrived slowly in the village, brushing the trees with new green and softening the frozen ground. The clearing, once a scar of mud and memory, was now dotted with wild flowers and young grass. The earth, like the people who lived nearby, was learning how to heal. Emma stood at the edge of the field, the soft morning light warming her face. In her hands was a small wooden plaque, simple, hand-carved, no grand inscription, just 2 words, "Remember here." She knelt, placing it quietly among the grass where the giant paw print had long since faded into soil and roots. It wasn't meant as a monument, it was a whisper to anyone who came that something had mattered here, something worth pausing for. Emma straightened slowly, her knees stiff, and looked across the clearing. She could almost see old Ben at the far edge, his great head lifting toward the sky, his body turning back toward the forest, leaving behind the past, carrying only what mattered most. The villagers gathered that afternoon, not for a ceremony but for something quieter. Parents brought their children. Samuel Grant stood with his weathered hands folded. Even the rangers came, their presence soft, respectful. No one spoke much. Some laid pine boughs along the edges, others simply touched the ground, pressing fingers into the soil as if to feel the pulse of the land. Emma sat on her hill, notebook in her lap, watching the village weave its own quiet ritual of remembrance. She thought of how loss was a thread running through all of them, human, animal, earth alike, but so was resilience. So was the ability to carry on, to heal, to find meaning in the scars left behind. By sunset, the clearing emptied, people drifted home, the forest folding in around them. And as the first stars blinked into the sky, Emma closed her notebook, took one last look at the field below, and whispered into the evening breeze, "Thank you, old friend." That night, the village slept peacefully, and somewhere deep in the forest, under a canopy of ancient trees, a brown bear moved through the undergrowth, no longer a watcher of the past but a traveler toward whatever waited next. If this story touched your heart, subscribe to the channel and leave a like. Share it with someone who loves inspiring, emotional stories, and help us spread messages of remembrance, healing, and connection between humans and the wild.